this week we're gonna. I want to get back into Revelation 17 and the passages of Daniel that we were looking at, but there were a lot of significant things that happened this week. I think that kind of bring together a lot of issues that I'd like to at least address with you. Some of the major problems in the church today that I think were very apparent. We had political changes taking place in a number of countries. The inauguration of our president. So I have a lot of clips that I want to play today. I think I'll be able to tie them all together with an article that I read that I thought was excellent, that sort of hit the nail on the head about the problems, the major problem that we face today. And it came from, of all places, Christianity Today. It's an amazing article. I would highly recommend that you read it, and we'll talk about that towards the end. So I'm going to do a Middle East update first, then we'll get into some of the other things that were happened and were said this week, particularly in Washington, D.C. By the way, this is a website called Earth Views. So there's a website called Earth Views that has these very interesting, almost three-dimensional pictures of different places on Earth from different perspectives than you usually get. This is a high-altitude shot. This is the coastline of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, all the way down to Egypt. You see the Sinai Peninsula in the distance, and you're looking all the way down the land of Israel. This one is a little bit different shot taken, but looking all the way down through the Jordan Valley, all the way down to the Red Sea. So we talk a lot in here about the future. Everybody wants to know the future. There does appear to be trouble ahead. And the other thing, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, there is this convergence of events that is taking place where a lot of the things that the prophets talked about, that Daniel, that Ezekiel, that Jeremiah, Isaiah, John, other prophets talked about, that all seem to be in the beginning stages of coming to fulfillment, and they seem to be converging all at the same time. And that's something that we should expect. There's like an acceleration of events. People that I know that are professional Bible prophecy teachers all talk about the fact that it's reached the point where they're just not able to keep up on their own because there is so much happening week by week. I was emailing with Bill Koenig some this week, and he just says, I'm just overwhelmed at everything that's happening. You need to pray for Bill. He goes in and sits 15 to 20 feet away from President Obama sometimes at his news conferences. And I said, the fact that you can sit there and not yell is a tribute to you on here. So first, update. It's hard to believe that the revolution in Egypt and the Arab Spring is now over 2 years old. It seems like, well, it's probably hard to believe that it's 2 years old because it's still going on. The war in Syria is going on. They have now passed over 60,000 people have been killed in Syria in that civil war there. Effectively, they say that the Assad government is no more, that he is just a warlord that controls a large chunk of what used to be Syria, and that there are other warlords in charge of other portions of that country. The Saudi ambassador or foreign minister this week was asked about whether there would be possible for there to be a negotiated settlement in Syria to avoid fighting to the bloody end, and he said that he did not see that there was any way possible that would happen. You should also know that Saudi Arabia itself is on the brink of a revolution. There is one more prince that will replace the current king from the second generation of the descendants of the original king, Saud, who took power in 1932. There's only one left. They'll now move into the third generation where there are thousands of princes. There will be a lot of political infighting, and the country is very unstable, and there's a tremendous push for a revolution to take place. Part of the reason for that is this report that came out this week, which is Freedom in the World. And so you can interpret this, you can find this online. It's put out by the Freedom in the World, Freedom House. Green countries are free, purple are not free, and yellow are not very free, and getting worse in most cases. So this kind of gives you an idea of where, at least this, and I'm not sure the criteria that they use, but I think it's freedom of speech and assembly and some other things that they use to and economic controls that they use to judge whether a country is free. So I wonder how long we're going to stay green with the way things are going. But this is a little bit closer up picture. You can see that most of Asia and Africa is considered not free or trending to not free. Interesting picture is the Middle East, where the definitely not free countries predominate, the purple ones, surrounded by the yellow ones, but there's one little tiny green one right in the middle, Israel. And the report, I believe, does state, it's one of about 1 million things that I read this week, so don't quote me for accurate or hold me to accuracy, that there's one place where Arabs are free in the Middle East, and it's in the Jewish state of Israel. We had a number of spectacles in Washington this week, one of which was this exchange which took place.
That a simple phone call to those evacuees to determine what happened would have ascertained immediately that there was no protest. I mean, that was a piece of information that could have been easily obtained.
Well, but Senator,
within hours, if not days.
Senator, when you're in these positions, the last thing you want to do is interfere with any other process.
Well, I realize that's a good excuse.
Number two, no, it's the fact. Number two, I would recommend highly you read both what the ARB said about it and the classified ARB, because even today there are questions being raised. Now, we have no doubt they were terrorists, they were militants, they attacked us, they killed our people. But what was going on and why they were doing what they were doing?
No. Again, we were misled that there were supposedly protests and then something sprang out of that, and assault sprang out of that. And that was easily ascertained that was not the fact. And the American people could have known that within days, and they didn't know that.
With all due respect, the fact is we had 4 dead Americans. Was it because of a protest, or was it because of guys out for a walk one night and decided they'd go kill some Americans? What difference at this point does it make? It is our job to figure out what happened and do everything we can to prevent it from ever happening again, Senator. Now, honestly, I will do my best to answer your questions about this, but the fact is that people were trying in real time to get to the best information. The IC has a process, I understand, going with the other committees to explain how these talking points came out. But to be clear, it is, from my perspective, less important today, looking backwards, as to why these militants decided they did it, than to find them and bring them to justice. And then maybe we'll figure out what was going on in the meantime.
Okay, thank you, Madam Secretary.
Look, it does make a difference. It makes all the difference in the world what their motivation is. And this is what the takeaway should be from a Bible prophecy perspective. The Bible clearly tells us over and over again that in the end times there will be a deception that comes on the world. The deception will be so great that even the very elect could be deceived if the Lord did not intervene. And this deception will operate not only on a religious level, but it will be on a geopolitical level, because people will plead or give their devotion to the beast, to the Antichrist, to the man who has been indwelled by Satan to deceive the world in the final deception. And you're seeing I have no doubt that you're seeing the beginnings of this. Hillary Clinton cannot see the obvious fact that it does make every difference in the world what motivates these people, because no one in our government, and from the president on down, who started it off with regulations that we can't talk about Islamic terrorism, and now everybody in the government and her main assistant, her top assistant, is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. She grew up with parents who are prominent members of the Muslim Brotherhood, intellectual members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So for her to say that it doesn't make a difference, if it's just guys that do it, then okay, then do it as a criminal investigation. But if it's people that are motivated by a religious ideology, there's some seats up here, by a religious ideology, then for certain, you should look at what the cause is, because it makes all the difference in the world. Now, to show you the hypocrisy, this is a report that came out of West Point, challengers from the sidelines, understanding America's violent far right. This was put out by the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, by people in our military. In that report, in a footnote, it talks about one of the things that motivates people on the far right that we need to be concerned about, and that is a belief in the truth and inerrancy of Scripture, the Bible. So there, to the government there, it makes a difference, but when it's so obvious, they get in front of Congress and lie like that. It's just beyond comprehension. But this is going to be a continued problem. The reports are that all over that the Algerian attacks show that the militants, Al-Qaeda, is well organized, well armed, all throughout the Islamic Maghreb, this African Maghreb, this area in yellow mainly, in Mali, Niger, Algeria, but that they are attacking far away from that center base, that they're organized enough to do that. There were reports this week too that the people that had attacked, and these, by the way, the distances here, I don't think there's a scale on here, or I might have it covered up. Oh, top left. It's a substantial distance from Benghazi to this Algeria refinery that was attacked. Well over 500 miles. They are now believed that some of the same militants that attacked our diplomatic outpost in Benghazi are the same ones that attacked the refinery in Algeria. So they're able to cover very vast distances. And it does make a difference what's motivating these people, regardless of what she says. Another important thing happened this week in Israel was the Israeli elections. The result in Israel was not quite as bad as the result in the United States, from my perspective, the bad result in the United States, but it was very close. Benjamin Netanyahu's party went from essentially 42 seats in the Knesset to 31. Now, what he has to do is he has to form a coalition of at least, I think, 61 votes. So his party has 31, so he has to go to the other parties to try to pick up enough votes to continue to be the prime minister. Now, he's likely to do that, but it will come at some cost. There's questions about, well, I'll talk about this in a minute. One of the parties, and now I can't remember the name of the party, Jeremy Gimple, who has Land of Israel website, you can watch the show that he does with his friend. Jeremy is from Atlanta. His friend is from Houston. They made Aliyah to Israel. They're Jews, but this is Jeremy speaking last year at a church down in Florida.
This is where it gets good. They lay the cornerstone of the temple in Jerusalem. You could imagine today if the dome, the golden dome, I'm being recorded so I can't say blown up, but let's say the dome was blown up, right? And we laid the cornerstone of the temple in Jerusalem. Can you imagine what it would, none of you would be here. You would all be like, I'm going to Israel, right? No one would be here. It would be incredible. I would say things that are so radical I would get thrown out of Israel. But I'm going to say it anyway. The Jews would build churches. We would build them. We're not a proselytizing religion. That's not what we do. That's not our mandate. We are not meant to proselytize. There are far too many Jews already. We don't want you to be Jews. We want you to be the best Christians you can be. That's the honest truth. We really believe that. A good Christian is going to heaven.
Now look, you need to pray for Jeremy and his partner. What's his name? Arya Abramowitz?
Ari.
A-R-I, okay. And I know that Bill and Claudia Koenig, who are making several long trips to Israel each year now, are very good friends with Jeremy and Ari, and they are witnessing to them. They're sharing the gospel with them, so you need to pray that Jeremy and Ari become Christians. They believe, you can find this video online of about an hour and a half talk that he gave at Fellowship Church in, I think, Land O'Lakes or Winter Garden, Florida, in late 2011. He got a lot of heat for that because he did say that what he said, I can't say that I want the Dome of the Rock blown up, but because I'm being recorded, but what if it is blown up? And you can find many videos of them. They do excellent work. They are very much aware that the rebirth of the state of Israel is the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And earlier in this talk, he says, I don't understand how anybody could not be a Christian Zionist, because we have watched a miracle take place in our lifetimes, the rebirth of the nation of Israel, Jews coming from all over the world to revitalize that country, to establish a Jewish state in the heart of the Islamic Middle East, and yet people think that the Bible is irrelevant. And he's speaking to a lot of people in the church, the replacement theology people, who don't see it as anything. It's just an accident of history. It's not. It's the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, and it's an indication that we live near the return of the Lord. This is sort of a graphic of what Benjamin Netanyahu has to do to form a new government. This comes from, this was, I think, Thursday's Jerusalem Post. And the question is he going to try to form a right-wing government and bring in the Orthodox and the religious parties? The Israeli politics is very fragmented. Okay, here we have two parties pretty much that fight against each other. There they have a dozen parties that fight against each other. And there were, I think, about a dozen parties that got some member of Knesset. And they argue, and they don't get along, but then they have to form a coalition. And how they form a coalition will indicate things about how that peace process goes. So is it going to be a right-wing government? Is it going to be a unity government? Lapid is the leader of one of the parties that sort of center-left parties that Benjamin Netanyahu is talking to. There is the, is it the Bayat Yehudi party? That is the led by a man named Bennett. Jeremy Gempel ran for the Knesset. He did not win his election as a member of that party. They were predicted to get as many as 16 seats. Netanyahu's party was in the coalition that he has with Lieberman's party were predicted to get 42. Netanyahu's group got 31 instead of 42. That's a significant slap in his face. The conservative settler party under the control of this man named Bennett that opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state was predicted to get 16, and then they essentially got 12 members of the Knesset. So it's interesting to see if Netanyahu, who's sort of leaning towards tying up with the center-left people, it indicates that they might be more willing to engage in a two-state peace solution. Now, I personally think, as I read and study Ezekiel 35 through 37, is that there is a temporary, at least for a short time, it will not last, a temporary two-state solution. I think that's prophesied in Ezekiel. And that may be the next thing that happens. So I would expect that would be more likely if Netanyahu throws in with the center-left party, because that's what they want to establish. And this is sort of the key as to what's going to happen with this area. This area that's in the light brown is the mountain area of Israel, Judea and Samaria. Read Ezekiel 35 through 37. get what I did about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago on that passage, because that passage in Ezekiel 35 through 37 talks about the mountains of Israel. And the fact that at the end there's a group of people who take control of the mountains of Israel and get very proud because of that. The description in the scripture there is very similar to what happened when Gaza was turned over to the Palestinians back in 2005. Now, the reaction was then that they tried to kill Israelis. The reaction will be that they will try to kill Israelis. And that, I believe, if I'm reading it correctly, that could be possibly what is the trigger for, say, the Psalm 83 war that we've been reading about, that Bill Salas wrote a book about. By the way, if you want an update on the Psalm 83 book, it was called Israelistine. I believe it's now Psalm 83 Today or something. Go to Prophecy Depot. It's either prophecydepot.net or .com. You can buy that book. I'm supposed to be meeting with Mr. Salas when I go to California in about 5 weeks. So we've been emailing for a while, but the beauty of email is you never meet these people face to face. But I think I'm going to finally get to meet them face to face. So that's in process. But what the proposal is that Israel would turn over the light areas. Netanyahu seems to be willing to do that. The center left says turn it all over, this area of Judea and Samaria. But Israel, if they're smart, will keep a buffer zone along the Jordan River. So they have a buffer with the nation of Jordan, because over half of Jordan are Palestinians, and there would be a lot of infiltration. So it will be bad enough if they give this territory over to the control of the Palestinians under Hamas, or even under the guy from the other party, the other faction that controls this area in the mountains of Israel. But when you read through Ezekiel 35 through 37, focus on the mountains of Israel, what happens to them, and what the people's reaction is. Because this happens before that Ezekiel 38-39 war, and I think it's a separate series of events. And all of this, what the point of all this is, with the elections this week, this scenario of a two-state solution, at least a temporary one, seems to be more viable than at any time in recent memory. So, now, other things going on in Israel. This is a report that was released this week called the Red Sea, Dead Sea Water Conveyance Study Program, Feasibility Study, or Red Dead, as they called it, as opposed to MedDead. And what it talks about is the fact that this is looking, the Dead Sea is right here. This is looking down that rift, the northern end of the Great Rift Valley that goes all the way down to Lake Victoria in Africa. It's the largest crack in the Earth's crust. It goes down to the Red Sea here. This is the Gulf of Aqaba. There's the Eilat. Israeli city is here. The Jordanian city of Aqaba and Egyptian. The three countries kind of converge right here, and there's some resorts. So the thinking is, the Red Sea is drying up. It used to extend in this whole area here. It is an incredibly rich mineral area. Potassium is one of the most important. I'm not a farmer, but I did sort of understand the sermon a little bit this morning. One of the important fertilizers in the world, they use potassium. Israel, this area of the Dead Sea, is pretty much accepted to have enough potassium to provide the potassium needed for fertilizer for the entire world for over 200 years. That will give you some idea of the minerals in the Dead Sea. but it's drying up. In fact, you go there, and things that used to be on the shore now are, and I know, Mike, you've been there, they're a good quarter of a mile sometimes away from where these hotels that used to be right on the shore of the Dead Sea, and now you got to walk down staircases that they've built 100 feet or more, like 10 stories, to get down to where the water is in the Dead Sea. It's the lowest place on earth, the shore of the Dead Sea. So what they've thought is, let's take water from one of these oceans and pipe it over to the Dead Sea to replenish the water. That has a number of benefits. You should look at this study. Jimmy DeYoung talks about it a lot. There were a couple of what they call med-dead proposals to run a pipeline or a canal from just south of Haifa or between Haifa and Tel Aviv, either to the Sea of Galilee or to the northern end of the Dead Sea. Those don't seem to be viable because of the population and the things that it would have to go over in between, like mountains. But this is the most viable one. It's called the Red Dead Project. It would be a pipeline, and because it has some amazing benefits. It'll replenish that area, get rid of some of the sinkholes and that type of thing. But as you know, this is 1,400 feet below sea level. This is amazingly sea level because it's part of the ocean. In fact, if you ever wonder, sea level is sea level all over the world, except in the mid-ocean ridge. But I don't want to get into those technicalities. But to pipe this water here, it will go down 1,400 feet, about the height of the Sears Tower, whatever they call it now in Chicago. Going down that direction will allow them to do a number of things. They will have the force of gravity to push things through desalinization filters. They will have hydroelectric power, and so they will get fresh water out of it, which they desperately need in that area, some to Jordan, some to Israel. Will replenish the Dead Sea. It will also be useful, I have heard, for them to then begin to mine minerals from the bottom of the Dead Sea in this area. And there are estimates that there is an unbelievable amount of gold and silver located on the bottom of the Dead Sea. I only raise this to suggest to you that this project has now been determined that it's likely to happen. There is something that goes on in Ezekiel 38. You can read about Ezekiel 38:11, I think, that talks about one of the reasons that this coalition of nations, led by a country from the north, joined by Persia, Libya, and a coalition of what Islamic countries are, coming against Israel in the last days, is to get a prize. Okay? It mentions, I believe in that passage, I don't have it open, but I think it mentions gold and silver. Verse 13, 38:13. What's it say, David?
It says,
Speak up.
All right, let's see, they're talking about the spoil. Hast thou gathered thy company to take thy prey, to carry away silver and gold, and to take away cattle goods, to take a great spoil?
Okay. I'm just saying that this is a recent development happening when all this other stuff is happening. I don't know if this is the case, but there is a belief, because this Dead Sea has been collecting runoff and drainage for a long time. And as you said, if it has that much potassium to supply the world for a couple hundred years, there may be gold down there. And if they mine that gold, then there would be a lot of wealth, spoil, whatever. And Israel's economy is doing pretty well, so that's interesting. So that's the Middle East update. Now I'm going to give you, and that took longer than I thought as usual. I'm going to play for you this. I try to bring in things from you that I think confirm the truth of Scripture and creation. This is a TED presentation back in 2007 in Monterey, and this guy will explain what they're doing. They're doing a project to study what goes on in this cell, a cell of the human body, and how can we explain it?
I'm a medical illustrator, and I come from a slightly different point of view. I've been watching, since I grew up, the expressions of truth and beauty in the arts and truth and beauty in the sciences, and while these are both wonderful things in their own right, they both have very wonderful things going for them. Truth and beauty as ideals that can be looked at by the sciences and by math are almost like the ideal conjoined twins that a scientist would want to date. These are expressions of truth as awful things, by meaning they are things you can worship. They are ideals that are powerful, they are irreducible, they are unique, they are useful, sometimes often a long time after the fact. And you can actually roll some of the pictures now, because I don't want to look at me on the screen. Truth and beauty are things that are often opaque to people who are not in the sciences. They are things that are that describe beauty in a way that is often only accessible if you understand the language and the syntax of the person who studies the subject in which truth and beauty is expressed. If you look at the math E equals mc squared, if you look at the cosmological constant, where there's an anthropic ideal where you see that life had to evolve from the numbers that describe the universe, these are things that are really difficult to understand. And what I've tried to do since I had my training as a medical illustrator, since I was taught animation by my father, who was a sculptor and my visual mentor, I wanted to figure out a way to help people understand truth and beauty in the biological sciences by using animation, by using pictures, by telling stories, so that the things that are not necessarily evident to people can be brought forth and can be taught and can be understood. And students today are often immersed in an environment where what they learn is subjects that have truth and beauty embedded in them, but the way they're taught is compartmentalized, and it's drawn down to the point where the truth and beauty are not always evident. It's almost like that old recipe for chicken soup, where you boil the chicken until the flavor is just gone. And we don't want to do that to our students. So we have an opportunity to really open up education. And I had a telephone call from Robert Liu at Harvard in the Molecular and Cellular Biology Department a couple of years ago. And he asked me if my team and I would be interested and willing to really change how medical and scientific education is done at Harvard. And so we embarked on a project that would explore the cell, that it would explore the truth and beauty inherent in molecular and cellular biology, so that students could understand a larger picture that they could hang all of these facts on, that they could have a mental image of the cell as a large, bustling, hugely complicated city that's occupied by micro-machines. And these micro-machines really are at the heart of life. These micro-machines, which are the envy of nanotechnologists the world over, are self-directed, powerful, precise, accurate devices that are made out of strings of amino acids. And these micro-machines power how a cell moves. They power how a cell replicates. They power our hearts. They power our minds. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to figure out how we could make this story into an animation that would be the centerpiece of BioVisions at Harvard, which is a website that Harvard has for its molecular and cellular biology students that will, in addition to all the textual information, in addition to all the didactic stuff, put everything together visually so that these students would have an internalized view of what a cell really is in all of its truth and beauty, and be able to study with this view in mind so that their imaginations would be sparked, so that their passions would be sparked, and so that they would be able to go on and use these visions in their head to make new discoveries and to be able to find out really how life works. So we set out by looking at how these molecules are put together. We worked with a theme, which is you've got macrophages that are streaming down the capillary, and they're touching the surface of the capillary wall, and they're picking up information from cells that are on the capillary wall, and they are given this information that there's an inflammation somewhere outside where they can't see and sense, but they get information that causes them to stop, causes them to internalize that they need to make all of the various parts that will cause them to change their shape and try to get out of this capillary and find out what's going on. So these molecular motors, we had to work with the Harvard scientists and data bank models of the atomically accurate molecules and figure out how they moved and figure out what they did and figure out how to do this in a way that was truthful in that it imparted what was going on, but not so truthful that the compact crowding in a cell would prevent the vista from happening. And so what I'm going to show you is a 3-minute Reader's Digest version of the first aspect of this film that we produced. It's an ongoing project that's going to go another 4 or 5 years. And I want you to look at this and see the paths that the cell manufactures, these little walking machines. They're called kinesins that take these huge loads that would challenge an ant in relative size. Run the movie, please. But these machines that power the inside of the cells are really quite amazing, and they really are the basis of all life, because all of these machines interact with each other, they pass information to each other, they cause different things to happen inside the cell, and the cell will actually manufacture the parts that it needs on the fly from information that's brought from the nucleus by molecules that read the genes. And no life, from the smallest life to everybody here, would be possible without these little micro machines. In fact, it would really, in the absence of these machines, have made the attendance here, Chris, really quite sparse. This is the FedEx delivery guy in the cell. This little guy is called a kinesin, and he pulls a sac that's full of brand new manufactured proteins to wherever it's needed in the cell, whether it's to a membrane, whether it's to an organelle, whether it's to build something or repair something. And each of us has about 100,000 of these things running around right now inside each one of your 100 trillion cells. So no matter how lazy you feel, you're not really intrinsically doing nothing. So what I want you to do when you go home is think about this and think about how powerful our cells are, and think about some of the things that we're learning about cellular mechanics. And once we figure out all that's going on, and believe me, we know almost 1% of what's going on. Once we figure out what's going on, we're really going to be able to have a lot of control over what we do with our health, with what we do with future generations, how long we're going to live, and hopefully we'll be able to use this to discover more truth and more beauty. It's really quite amazing that these cells, these micro machines, are aware enough of what the cell needs that they do their bidding, they work together, they make the cell do what it needs to do, and their working together helps our bodies, huge entities that they will never see, function properly. Enjoy the rest of the class.
Well, that's pretty amazing. And the thing that I take away from that is, 3,000 years ago, King David wrote that he was fearfully and wonderfully made, not knowing even a small 0.1% of the small 1% that we know now. But as we learn more, it amazes me too that people are so willing to believe the lie that all of this happened by random chance. There's no way. It's just not mathematically possible. Now, I don't know if Dr. Belinsky is a believer or not, but for people to sit there in the face of all that evidence and say that we just evolved by chance, accident, that is an incredible design. The greatest engineers on the planet can't design machines like that not only operate in that one cell, but in the billions of cells within your body, all doing very specific functions. It's an amazing thing. So, this was in the British press this week, apocalyptic threat posed by antibiotic resistance. The head of the chief medical officer of the British, their most senior medical advisor in Britain, said that because of the use of antibiotics and the overuse and the development of superbugs, she described what she called an apocalyptic scenario where people going for simple operations in 20 years' time die of routine infections because we have run out of antibiotics. If any of you have had surgery recently, you know that they don't let you stay in the hospital very long at all. They're trying to kick you out. In fact, I think Anna Seisinger had a hip replacement done back in December, and that's now done, absent any other medical issues, on an outpatient basis. So you go in the morning, you go home in the afternoon. Part of it is because of this concern that is growing. So, but I think I'm going to skip over, I'm going to do just a little bit of economic, because the other thing that's converging with superbugs and all this other stuff is an economic problem. Now, you might have heard the news. I saw NBC News Friday night. Economy is recovering. Everything's back. Housing starts are up. In fact, they interviewed somebody who's head of Trueberry Homes here in Columbus on NBC Nightly News, saying, yeah, we think this is going to be a great year because home starts are up. Well, they are relative to, this stuff in 2010 and 11, they're up a little bit. But compared to what they were, it's not going to happen. This is at zero hedge. I won't go through all of this, but I want you to listen to what this is, an economist, Dr. Tim Morgan, who says this. The economy, as we know it, is facing a lethal confluence of four critical factors. The fallout from the biggest debt bubble in history, a disastrous experiment with globalization, the massaging of data to the point where economic trends are obscured, and most important of all, the approach of an energy returns cliff edge. Through technology, through culture, and through economic and political change, society is more short-term in nature now than at any time in recorded history. Financial market participants can carry out transactions in milliseconds. With 24-hour news coverage, the media focus has shifted inexorably from the analytical to the immediate. The basis of politicians' calculations has shortened to the point where it can seem that all that matters is the next soundbite, the next headline, and the next snapshot of public opinion. The corporate focus has moved all too often from strategic planning to immediate profitability as represented by the next quarter's earnings. The report explains that this acceleration towards ever greater immediacy has blinded society to a series of fundamental economic trends which, if not anticipated and tackled well in advance, could have devastating effects. The relentless shortening of media, social, and political horizons, I might also add religious horizons, has resulted in the establishment of self-destructive economic patterns which now threaten to undermine economic viability. We date the acceleration in short-termism to the early 1980s. There's this thing about supposedly somebody back in the early, this supposedly comes from an old Chinese proverb. It's called half the chessboard. Oh, the guy that invented chess, that's right. The guy invented this. And the Chinese emperor said, wow, this is fantastic. What can I give you? And he said, well, all I want is a grain of rice. in one square of the chessboard, but I want you to then double it every day. Okay? So it would look something like this. You know, it would go from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. And the principle that you get from this is this exponential growth that takes place when you start getting up here. The second half of this chessboard is, the numbers are mind-boggling. You get up to about 2 billion here by half of the chessboard. So you've gone from 1 grain of rice to 2 billion grains of rice in a month.
And that's just the last day. The 2 billion is on the last day.
Yeah, that's the last day. You have all what's accumulated until then. Correct. And then it just goes down here to where you get to the end of the chessboard. But the principle of this is what these scientists talk about the singularity, that this merging of man and machines and technocracy that Martine Erdman and Patrick Wood talked to us about over the last couple of years, nanotechnology and the development of everything. I mean, look at what's happened in your lifetime. You know, I got my first computer in March of 1993. 20 years ago, I got my first desktop, my own computer at work. It was a massive machine, 386 processor, 2 megabytes of RAM, a 40 megabyte hard drive. It had a small floppy and a big floppy. It was state of the art. It had a monitor that would warm up and show me what was going on. You know, I would turn it on and then go get something to drink and come back and it would be going.
Heat your room too.
That's right. That was just 20 years ago. Now I carry around in my pocket a smartphone that has 64 gigabytes of storage. Our entire network for 40-some lawyers and secretaries, over 100 people, had 1 gigabyte of storage, if you added it all up. Now I carry 64 times that amount in my pocket. And Ron Allerton asked me once, how much storage do you have? And I have this terabyte thing and this terabyte thing and this 320. And, I've got about 6 or 7 or 8 terabytes worth of storage space at home. I gave Ray from China a flash drive with a bunch of prophecy stuff on it, 32 gigabytes. On this little tiny thing he can stick in his pocket. I hope he doesn't lose it. But massive amounts of information. 200 hours of teaching, video. I mean, it's an incredible thing. But what you need to take away from this is that, and we've talked about vectors in Bible prophecy, that towards the end, remember, at the time of Jesus' first coming, in the last week of Jesus' life, 60% of the messianic prophecies relative to his first coming were fulfilled in 1 week. They were slowly fulfilled right around the time of his birth, the announcement of his birth. John the Baptist as well. A few here, and then all of a sudden an explosion, an exponential explosion. What happened at the time of Jesus' first coming is what will happen at the time of Jesus' second coming. So the explosion of the fulfillment of Bible prophecy will occur. We're already into the stage where I think we're at the end. The rebirth of the nation of Israel in 1948 was sort of the kickoff. But as we approach the end, Daniel says knowledge will increase, and I think that's knowledge of the prophetic scriptures. And things that we ignored and sealed up, that were sealed up, are going to come alive to us in a way that will hopefully blow your mind in the right way. There will be this convergence. Now, this is also happening in technology and nanotechnology, and what can be used to teach good stuff can also be used to do bad stuff. And there is a coming world leader that will be fully committed to the technocratic vision of what's coming. So, this, by the way, this is Mahoney, the cardinal, this is on the front page of the LA Times today. They actively took steps, the Catholic Church, to impede priests from getting counseling because they were afraid that they were going to get charged with sex abuse crimes. So this is just real quick, and then I've got a few things. I'm going to go till noon. So if you have to leave, don't stay around just because I want you to. But America's least minded Bible cities in terms of Bible reading and Bible belief. These are kind of interesting. Buffalo, Cedar Rapids. Number 8 is Phoenix. Number 7, San Francisco. That's a big surprise. Yeah. Number 6 is Boston. That's not a big surprise. I've spent a lot of time there. Hartford, New Haven is number 5. Portland, Maine. Burlington, Vermont, number 3. Albany, New York, number 2. And Providence, Rhode Island, number 1. Okay. Big events in Washington this week, and I've got to cover this. Newsweek called it the second coming. That's the cover of Newsweek. Fortunately, that's only an online magazine now, so nobody will actually see that in print. A lot of things. He laid out his liberal vision, his progressive vision, his this and that. It's interesting. The headlines about Obama, liberal, progressive, dynamic, future, all this stuff. Netanyahu winning, it looks like, in Israel. Hardliners take control. The radical hardliner right wing takes control. I want to play a couple clips. I'm going to skip. I'm going to just show grace and mercy.
Always understood that when times change, so must we. That fidelity to our founding principles requires new responses to new challenges. That preserving our individual freedoms ultimately requires collective action. For the American people can no more meet the demands of today's world by acting alone than American soldiers could have met the forces of fascism or communism with muskets and militias. No single person can train all the math and science teachers we'll need to equip our children for the future, or build the roads and networks and research labs that will bring new jobs and businesses to our children. Now, more than ever, we must do these things together as one nation and one people. Our journey is not complete until our gay brothers and sisters are treated like anyone else under the law. For if we are truly created equal, then surely the love we commit to one another must be equal as well. That is our generation's task. To make these words, these rights, these values of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness real for every American. Being true to our founding documents does not require us to agree on every contour of life. It does not mean we all define liberty in exactly the same way or follow the same precise path to happiness. Progress does not compel us to settle centuries-long debates about the role of government for all time, but it does require us to act in our time.
Just one more.
We, the people, still believe that our obligations as Americans are not just to ourselves, but to all posterity. We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations. Some may still deny the overwhelming judgment of science, but none can avoid the devastating impact of raging fires and crippling drought and more powerful storms.
But I, your great leader, will be able to control all of that God sends as judgment.
My next guest says the president laid out his true agenda, destroying the founding principles of this nation of a limited government to meet what he calls his leftist needs. Joining us now is Ben Shapiro, editor-at-large, Breitbart News, author of the book Bullies: How the Left's Culture of Fear and Intimidation Silences America. Ben, good to have you with us. Now, I understand Professor Prothero is watching carefully to see what he could learn about your conservative perspective for his own use. Welcome. What did you think?
Thanks for having me. That was, I mean, what an Orwellian speech. I mean, talk about a reversal of every term that Americans hold dear. Liberty becomes collective action. Absolutism is opposed to principle. Everything that he says was basically turning American history on its head. As it turns out, I also learned things about myself during that speech that I found educational. Turns out that if I oppose Obama, I hate women, I hate gays, I hate old people, I hate the disabled, and I'm also a denier of science. So I found out all those things today, and yet President Obama said that we are a united country. So in that way, it was a unique speech.
And he also said, quote, "We understand that outworn programs are inadequate." If we could put this up for the audience to read if they did not hear it. "We understand that outworn programs are inadequate to the needs of our time. We must harness new ideas and technology to remake our government. That is what will give real meaning to our creed." So in other words, the founding principles and values of the nation have no reality unless we remake our government and apparently support some ideas and technology that is unmentioned or perhaps not even available right now.
He hates the Constitution. I mean, that's what it comes down to. What his speech came down to, he said, we have to adapt founding principles to our changing times, to our changing needs. We must change. No, you know what? The Constitution was written with an unchanging view of human nature in mind. And the left believes that the only thing that can change human nature on a fundamental level is collective action, i.e. the government. So the Constitution stands in the way of their grand plan to change human nature as it is currently constituted. And that's why everything that you hear coming out of Obama is about changing who we are as people. And what that involves is a tremendous reversal of all basic common sense. It turns out that if you want to keep your own money, you're now a taker. Whereas if you are a recipient of Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid, you're contributing to the collective well. I mean, this is completely turned language upside down. I thought the key line of the entire speech, President Obama said it near the end, he said, "Our founding creed doesn't dictate that we agree on what liberty constitutes." Actually, Mr. President, it does. That may be the only thing that our founding creed dictates, because if we weren't fighting for liberty against tyranny, what is the Declaration of Independence about? He's just rendered all of our founding documents meaningless in the name of big government progressivism. News media understands this. President Obama's goal is to fundamentally remake the nation. And what that requires is not bipartisanship. It means completely destroying his opposition through bully tactics by calling us racist, bigots, sexist, homophobes. That's what that speech was about. That's what his agenda is about. And that's what this news media, which is calling, I mean, how could you possibly call that a bipartisan speech? You have to be so on the Kool-Aid. I mean, they're running out of Kool-Aid supply all over the country to buy into that.
So, Ben Shapiro, I love the guys at Breitbart, and he's very accurate as to what that speech is. This is a little clip about...
out there, it's wrong, but what the heck? We're going to go with it. We're going to look you straight in the eye, and we're going to lie to you. What are you going to do about it?
Is raising new questions tonight about the accuracy of PG&E's controversial new smart meters.
People all over the state have been complaining about inflated bills.
Her bill was $873. It does not save energy, so smart grids miss the mark on energy savings.
It's all about money. We're going to be charged for time of use one day. It's coming.
And they're going to start having a profile of you as an individual. How you use your time, how you spend your energy, what you think.
Right down to the micro level. I mean, this is control freakery. It is the wet dream of the technocrats.
And we've got massive data storage areas that never existed before, specifically to accommodate the accumulation of this kind of knowledge.
The next thing you know, people are walking up in the early morning hours to people's houses, taking off the analog meters and putting on the smart meters without telling anybody.
And now there are real concerns that they can blow a fuse, even explode, and put those homes at risk.
Half a dozen smart meters across 1 to 2 sub.
Well, look, I'm not going to stop it there. You can find that online. Some people have been sending it around. watch the clip. Understand, Martine Erdman, Patrick Wood have been here over the last 3 years telling us that the final form of religion might be technocracy, this belief that we're going to build this great kingdom and this great nation, this great thing on earth. And one of the ways they're going to do that is when the currency collapses, Patrick Wood believes that the new currency will be energy credits. How will they monitor your energy credits? But through a smart meter. These are being installed all over the country. It may be unstoppable. You just should know about it. You should make preparation that things are changing. It's a good time for the church to learn to be the church. Now, I'm not going to play this. You should go to Prager University and find out about what he calls the American Trinity. You can find it on every coin. So go to Prager University, American Trinity. You need to watch it. Now, I want to give credit to Christianity Today. Last week we criticized them, called them Christianity Astray, because of their promotion of a thing called Chrislam, where it doesn't make any difference if somebody stays in the mosque, if they accept Jesus. It's just their cultural context, and that eviscerates the gospel. But the editor, I think his name is Mark Galley, of Christianity Today, has a new article that I think hits the mark about so much that is wrong in the evangelical church today. This article resonated with me, so I'm going to read a chunk of it, this editorial. The troubled state of Christian preaching. Listen to what he says. This is coming from the editor of Christianity Today is just like, it's like coming from I can't believe it. But give them credit where credit is due. In the long run, we cannot gain a hearing for the gospel through our admirable ethics or social justice, because in the end we are still sinners, with hearts, as the prophet Jeremiah put it, that remain desperately wicked. When we do live well or accomplish a social good, we will be admired for our moral success, not because Jesus died to save a rebellious world. And when we fail to live up to our values, and we invariably will, well, we will look like every other sinner on the planet. Not much of a witness there except to our humanity. And you see this push in the evangelical church to do good works, social justice. I see people setting up projects, and they never, ever, they say, we started these many businesses, we set up this many wells, this many farms, this many businesses, and they never talk about sharing the gospel. This editorial addresses that. In the New Testament era, by contrast, the big problem was the scandal of the cross. It's not hard to see why. Among the many things the cross says is this: we're as dead as Jesus. The situation is so bad for each individual. We're so dead that only the sacrifice of another, again, Jesus who hangs there as true God, can remedy it. For people like us who imagine we're not so much dead as suffering a cold, and that if we take our vitamin C and will ourselves out of bed, we can make a go of it, well, this verdict can sound unnerving. Worse, to be told that we can do nothing to revive ourselves, that we are left completely at the mercy of this other, well, this just doesn't sit well in our cultures, let alone in a culture that prizes individual initiative and heroic effort. It's interesting that our culture is rarely scandalized by this preaching of the cross. That's probably because it is a rare theme of Christian preaching these days. Instead, we have been smitten with practical preaching that helps people become successful in life and business, and with ethical preaching that tells people how to live better. I cannot begin to tell you the number of times I have talked to pastors about just preach sin, repentance, the cross, the resurrection, the second coming. Well, we have to be practical. We have to tell people how to live. We want them to have a better marriage. We want them to have a better sex life. We want them to be more ethical businessmen. And the cross gets eviscerated and lost. And a half-truth is no truth, Continuing, this is done for the noblest of reasons, to show the gospel relevant to people's daily needs. But one can see where this has gotten us. When the cross is preached, it is often preached in a way that falls on deaf ears. It's seen as a theme for theologians to wax eloquent about, with strange words like propitiation and justification. or something comforting to guilt-ridden religious type, but meaningless to regular human beings. Unfortunately, in a desire to reach the world for Christ, some inadvertently reversed Giglio, the man who was taken off the president's inaugural preaching, prayer team, whatever. Some inadvertently reverse Giglio's priorities and make much about our ultimate significance. In light of that inaugural address, I think this is particularly appropriate. Jesus becomes merely the means by which we feel better about our place in the universe. Need purpose and meaning? Follow Jesus. That will do the trick. In this subtle shift, we become the first and last, the Alpha and the Omega. Need-driven preaching communicates that Jesus is just another way to solve our problems. It is no wonder that the culture looks at us, pats us on the head, and says, "But we found other equally valid ways to solve our problem, thank you." We tend to think the postmoderns have brought relativism down upon us, but it seems we Christians have been the culprits the more we make our message about meeting people's needs. Again, I can't believe this is in Christianity Today. I know how it got by the editor because he wrote it. But the most needful and difficult task of the church today is to again preach the message of the cross, and to do so in a way that alarms, surprises, scandalizes, challenges, invigorates, and inspires a 21st century world. In the most general terms, it has to be about Christ first and last. It has to be about Christ who came into the world not to improve generally good people, but to resurrect the dead. Not to bolster our self-esteem, but to forgive us. Not to make people successful, but to make them loving. Not to win a culture, but to establish a kingdom without end. Amen to that. I wish every preacher, find it online, send the link, share it on Facebook, send it to every preacher that you know. Because the church, by and large, is missing it. With this needs-based, seeker-sensitive, purpose-driven stuff that doesn't address the real issue. We're dead without Christ. We are dead, dead, dead. You cannot begin to know how dead you are. We're not just a little bit broken. We're totally, completely, spiritually dead. Our only hope is Jesus Christ and the sacrifice that he gave for us on the cross and his resurrection 3 days later and his return. Absent that, it's all a bunch. I'll quote a young lady that said this to me. It's just a bunch of fluff. Boy, was she right. Now, I want to go this. I'm going to go after 12 because we got to get through this. So stay if you want or get the tape. Andy Stanley spoke at St. John's Church on the morning of the inauguration. During that, there was no tape, no video. It was private. There was a pool report that came out from the news media that was there, and they said Andy said Obama was the pastor-in-chief, referring to what he did when he went to Sandy Hook. Now, let me ask you this question. Andy Stanley is considered one of the preeminent evangelical pastors in America. North Point Church in Atlanta, huge church, son of Dr. Charles Stanley, has this giant conference. They meet around the country 4 times a year called Catalyst. Do you know that our Grace Brethren Missions moved to Atlanta to be close to Catalyst Conference? That it's actively promoted among all the Grace Brethren ministries on a national level? Go to Catalyst, it's so great. Let me ask you this. Lou Giglio was axed from the program because he had preached a sermon calling homosexuality a sin 20 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago. Do you think that if Andy Stanley had ever preached a sermon like that, that he would have been left on the program? What's that tell you? You need to hear what I'm going to say. Now, I played for you a clip, and I'm not going to go through it, last year where he talked about this homosexual couple in his church and how they were allowed to serve and everything. And people ask him after that message, April 15th, 2012. You can go to the North Point website. You can still find it. They ask him, what do you think about homeless? He's never answered the question. He filibustered. He said, well, just listen to the rest of the series and you'll figure it out. But I know I figured it out. You spoke at the gay rights president inauguration service, and if you had ever spoke out about this being a sin, buddy, you're off the program. So he has compromised himself. In fact, if you go to the Catalyst East conference that just happened, it was advertised on the Grace Brethren websites. Be sure to get your discount. We have a discount as a group and everything. And one of the speakers at the conference, this is a church pastor leader conference, my friends, was Sam Adams. Who is Sam Adams? Sam Adams is the gay mayor of Portland, Oregon. And he came because we're going to show how great it is for churches and cities to have partnerships and do things. And he spoke at Catalyst. In fact, even in the bio, it says Adams lives in the Kenton neighborhood of North Portland, avid gardener. His partner, Peter Zuckerman, is an author. They didn't hide it. So where do you think Andy Stanley stands? In leadership, I found this. This was from a few years ago. He was asked questions about leadership. All this stuff about leadership in the church. Nothing about preaching the cross. They have conferences. They never talk about preaching the cross. They talk about leadership network, and all those groups. We've talked about them ad nauseum in here. But I want you to listen to what this preeminent evangelical pastor has to say about his role. Listen to this. What is distinctly spiritual about the kind of leadership you do? Stanley. There's nothing distinctly spiritual. I think it's a big problem in the church has been the dichotomy between spirituality and leadership. One of the criticisms I get is your church is so corporate. I read blogs all the time. Bloggers complain. The pastor's like a CEO. And I say, okay, you're right. Now, why is that a bad model? A principle is a principle, and God created all the principles. This is what they all say. So what's the principle behind the CEO model? Follow me. Follow we never works, ever. It's follow me. Follow the CEO. God gives a man or a woman the gift of leadership, and any organization that has a point leader with accountability and freedom to use their gift will do well. Unfortunately, in the church world, we're afraid of that. There's good reason. We're to follow Jesus. Has it been abused? Of course, but to abandon the model is silly. Churches should quit saying, oh, that's what the business does. That's the whole that whole attitude is so wrong and it hurts the church. In terms of the shifting culture, I say thanks to guys like Bill Hybels and others who have been unafraid to say we have a corporate side of our ministry. It's going to be the best corporate institution it can possibly be, and we're not going to try to merge first century. The church wasn't an organization in the first century. They weren't writing checks or buying property. The church has matured and developed over the years. We've evolved. We're way above what the apostles were. But for some reason, the last thing to change is the structure of leadership. By the way, this stuff, I should wear a blood pressure cuff in here, so put like a little thing up on the screen so you can see. And what did Bill Hybels say? I played this clip. I'm going to just play a minute of it here. What did he say last year? Now, Bill Hybels is the model. We all want to be Willow Creek. And I've told you the last two moderators of the Grace Brethren Fellowship, including the current one, are churches that are members of the Willow Creek Association. And they have a philosophy of ministry, and they're all tied in with Leadership Network and Rick Warren and all those types and Peter Drucker. Trust me, I've researched it more than you know. And what did Bill Hybels say? They asked him, they said, well, what about young leaders? What do you think about young leaders, Bill? And this was at the Catalyst conference last year. He said, well, I'll tell you what. I like that they're into social justice and doing good works. And he said, but this is what concerns me. Listen to just a little bit of this.
Now, what I get a little concerned about, it actually is the theology of a lot of young pastors who are coming into play these days, because there's such odd varieties of theologies out there these days, and everyone with a blog can have one. And so there's this kind of piecemeal, call it what you will, name it what you want, thing that gets talked about, that I find in some cases is not coherent and is not consistent with the New Testament as I understand it. So I think the need for theological training, and not just the one time where you get your ticket punched, but I mean theological rigor, theological inspection or reflection in groups where you actually get a group of pastors together and you say, let's spend 3 days working through this, that, or the other thing. I told you about this fun thing that I did. I've done this with several groups now, and I drew a quick version of it at the summit. But this will just illustrate my concern. Today, if you say to the average Christian leader, define the message that you're preaching. What's the message? Not what your mission is. We know your mission. We're not worried about it. What is your message? Well, it's a little of this, a little of this. And I go, what if you could only use 5 words to just kind of get at the root, at the core of the core of the core of what is the Christian message? Now, I've done this in several groups, and I won't take a lot of our limited time to do it now, but this here, you think is like a gentle, spirit-filled discussion? This gets ugly fast.
Now listen, it was the seeker-sensitive model of church that's come into play over the last 30 years, led by guys that Bill Hybels, that taught people so that now Bill Hybels says, boy, these guys don't know anything. What they behold theologically is frightening. He caused it. Now, I'm all on board that he laments it. Can I make a suggestion? Instead of lamenting it, he ought to be repenting of it. Okay? This is infusing our churches, people, and we as the body of Christ should not allow it to occur. You need to stand up, hold leaders accountable, whether you go to this church or other churches, to preach sin, repentance, the cross, because it is the biblical thing to do. It's not an issue of preference, as some people have put it. It is what is vital and necessary for the Christian message. Okay? Now, Andy Stanley will finish this. Just a couple more minutes. So why do pastors resist using business terms for leadership? I want you to listen what this man says. Because there are people in our congregation who have red flags go up. That's why we resist using the business terms. In other words, we don't really know what we're about. If you're a preacher's kid, you see the church differently. You know what? I have some experience in that area, and that's a bunch of the stuff you see. Yeah, it's not fluff. It's the stuff you see laying in the cow fields. I don't know how else to describe it. Having seen church from the inside out, it was very easy for me to abandon all that because I did not confer spirituality on congregational decision-making. To me, that system was just chaotic. It works against the gifts of the Holy Spirit in my mind, and it works against godly leadership principles. Here's an incredibly important principle. You cannot communicate complicated information to large groups of people. As you increase the number of people, you have to decrease the complexity of that information. Do you see why this guy who believes that the pastor's role is this could go to Barack Obama and say, you should be called the pastor-in-chief? Do you see the connection? It's not an accident, folks. As you increase the number of people, you have to decrease the complexity of information. Congregational rule, when you're trying to make a complicated decision, works against the principle. So consequently, the guy with the microphone and the clearest message always wins. The most persuasive person in the room is going to win, whether right or wrong. Should we stop talking about pastors as shepherds? Now, how does Scripture describe a pastor? As a shepherd. Who is the ultimate good shepherd? Jesus. Listen to what he says. Should we stop talking about them as shepherds? Absolutely. That word needs to go away. Jesus talked about shepherds because there was one over there in a pasture he could point to. But to bring in that imagery today and say, Pastor, you're the shepherd of the flock? No. No. I've never seen a flock. I've never spent 5 minutes with a shepherd. It was culturally relevant in the time of Jesus, but it's not culturally relevant anymore. Nothing works in our culture with that model except this sense of gentle pastoral care. Obviously, that is the face of church ministry, but that's not leadership. Isn't shepherd the biblical word for pastor? It's the first century word. If Jesus were here today, would he talk about shepherds? No. He would point to something that we all know, and we'd just say, oh yeah, I know what that is. Jesus told Peter the fisherman to feed my sheep. You see how this doesn't make any, this makes no intellectual sense. But Peter wasn't a shepherd either. But Jesus said, feed my sheep, Peter. Jesus told Peter the fisherman to feed my sheep, but he didn't say it to the rest of them. Go ye therefore into all the world and be shepherds and feed my sheep. By the time of the book of Acts, the shepherd model is gone. It's about establishing elders and deacons and their qualifications. Shepherding doesn't seem to be the emphasis.
Yeah, well, you got to read the last sentence.
Yeah, shepherding doesn't seem to be the emphasis. Even when it was cultural, an illustration of something. Thank you. I'm so glad people are paying attention. I really do. It's like, oh, I've reached them. You yell loud enough. What we have to do is identify the principle, which is that the leader is responsible for the care of the people he's been given, that I'm to care for and equip the people in the congregation to follow Jesus. But we take the literal illustration and bring it into our culture, then people can make it anything they want because nobody knows much about it.
Yeah, David was real gentle when he killed the lion and the bear.
In Ephesians, written, by the way, at the time of the book of Acts, it says that he gave some apostles, prophets, evangelists, some as pastors. The word there is poimen, which means shepherd. Paul in Acts chapter 20, Andy Stanley just said in Acts it wasn't there, right? Acts 20, Paul called the Ephesian elders to him and said, be on guard, verse 28, be on guard for yourselves and for the flock, among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to do what? To shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among you your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore be on the alert, remembering that night and day for a period of 3 years I did not cease to admonish each one of you, each one with tears. With, I would add, this information. Be shepherds, protect the flock. In Ezekiel 34, prophet Ezekiel talked about the shepherds of Israel. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to those shepherds, thus says the Lord God, woe! Shepherds of Israel have been feeding themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flock? You eat the fat and clothe yourselves with the wool. You slaughter the fat sheep without feeding the flock. Those who are sickly you have not strengthened. The diseased you have not healed. The broken you have not bound up. The scattered you have not brought back. Nor have you sought for the lost. But with force and with severity you have dominated them. They were scattered for lack of a shepherd, and they became food for every beast of the field and were scattered. I have clips of Adam Hamilton, who spoke at post-inauguration prayer thing the day after the inauguration. I will probably play those next week. That this man is called an evangelical. By the way, you know what he told Barack Obama? You'd make a good pastor. I'll play you the clip next week. You can find all this online. I will send out the link to download this hopefully later today. Because of the clips, it's going to be quite large. But I want you to understand that I speak to you today out of very strong conviction about what I see going on in the evangelical church on a very massive scale. And it is time that the people tell the shepherds what Ezekiel told the shepherds of Israel, in my opinion. You are free to disagree, but that's the case. So thank you very much for coming. Next week, we'll finish up this topic a little bit and get back in, hopefully, into Revelation 17 and Daniel. Thank you.